With that, I will turn the time over to Professor Eric Jensen.
All right, so is the mic working?
Yeah, you're good.
It is working. All right. So I am glad to see as many of you here as there are interested in law. I have to say that one of the reasons I love law is because it gives me a chance to use my mind and my heart as well as my testimony and commitment to the gospel all in one kind of job. And you'll see that today, I think, in my discussion, because what I hope to talk with you about today is how your morals, your commitment to the gospel, about your views of life will influence your ability to practice law, particularly in the area of national security. Now, how many of you, when you saw this, came because it was national security focused? How many of you, that's the draw? All right, well, I hope to convince the rest of you that doing law in national security is really an outstanding place to practice law. So let me first of all just take you from whatever you do and put you as a legal advisor working for the United States government. Working for the United States government is a unique position as a lawyer. And it's unique in a number of ways, and one of the ways is because you have to figure out who your client is. If you're working in a private firm and you have somebody come to talk to you because they've got a landlord issue, you know who your client is, right? Your client is that individual who's sitting across the desk from you asking you that question. If you're working for a corporation as in-house counsel, you know who your client is. Your client is that corporation, and your focus of your legal advice is to help that organization. But let me instead put you in the role of a government attorney. And let me just bring this up to date. Now, none of this scenario I'm about to give you is true. I am not sharing any kind of classified information or anything like that, I promise. But you all know what's going on right now with North Korea, right? North Korea's got some nuclear weapons. They're thinking about developing a nuclear program. They've shot missiles over South Korea and over Japan. It's a very big worry. The United Nations Security Council just voted to increase some very dramatic sanctions on North Korea to try and cut back their nuclear program and the development of nuclear weapons. Well, assume now that you are sitting in the councils of the Department of Defense as an attorney. And as part of your role, you're going to review the plans, the alternatives the Department of Defense comes up with to give to the President to say, look, here's something we can do to try and deal with this issue. And one of these issues, one of these proposals, not necessarily, again, I'm not promoting this, please don't take this the wrong way, but just think of this. One of these proposals is to assassinate Kim Jong-un, the current leader of North Korea. That's clearly an option. The military has the capability to do that. And you're a lawyer and you see this plan. Now, think about this in terms of who is your client when you think to give advice on that issue. You know that peacetime killing of a leader, we're not at war with North Korea, we're in an armistice right now, we're not at war with North Korea. The peacetime killing of a leader of another nation is generally thought to be illegal. There might be, in this case, a self-defense rationale that you could justify. So you're not completely in the dark on law. There might be a legal justification for doing something like this, though it would clearly be a minority view. How do you couch your advice? And rather than thinking about the content of your advice, think about who is your client. The Department of State in this case is clearly against this plan because they say, first of all, it's sketchy under international law. Secondly, what kind of precedent are we setting? Are we trying to tell the world now that the peacetime assassination of leaders is a good thing to do? I don't think that's what the U.S. wants to say, the State Department says. Who is your client? If your client is the Department of Defense, how does that influence your answer in comparison to if your client is the U.S. government as a whole, or if your client is the United States as a whole? How do you think that influences your view? If you accept your client as the United States Department of Defense, does this sound like a better option than if your client is the United States government as a whole?
If you're worried specifically about the defense of the country, it might be, as opposed to the reputation and repercussions in other areas.
Okay, so he says if you're worried about if you're worried about this impact on the Department of Defense as a whole, you might be, because there might be broader implications, right? I mean, you're thinking in your head, look, if we can send in SEAL Team 6 and they go in and assassinate Kim Jong-un, well, that is going to save a lot of lives, both North Koreans and U.S. military lives, right? If we have to have a military confrontation with North Korea, how many people are going to die? Well, so from the Department of Defense perspective, that might actually be a good thing. And if the Department of Defense was your client, that might actually be a good decision, right? Especially if you have, even if it's a sketchy legal option, but if you have another legal option. What if your client, if instead you're sitting in the Department of Defense, but you view your client as the United States as a whole? How might that affect your view?
Well, I think then you might consider more about like media and the United States, like the people, and so then you might think of it as a less beneficial option. But there, like, it still might be beneficial for protection purposes.
It might be,
Reasons.
but that State Department view might have a little more sway on your mind, right, as you contemplate this. All right, well, I introduced that topic really just to get you thinking about who your client is, because now I want to transition to a couple of topics dealing with law, policy, and morality. But keep in the back of your mind as we talk about this, who is your client and how do you address these legal issues with your client? Please.
If we're talking about the assassination of Kim Jong-un, then our client is who would be in opposition of us. And so it would be who's his alliance members, who are the strongholds, who govern the armies. And so it would probably be China.
Well, I don't think I mean, that's a way of looking at it, but I don't think if you're working for the Department of Defense, you're ever going to think, if you're working for the U.S. Department of Defense, that you're ever going to think that China is your client, at least not China specifically. Now, you might think that the world more at large, right? I mean, that the world writ large is your client in a sense that what you do with international law might impact how international law progresses. But for me, that's a bit more attenuated. Having worked in the government, I don't think I was ever in a circumstance where I thought the world was my client. But I often was in a situation where I had to decide, am I really representing the Department of Defense here? Am I representing the government? Am I representing the United States people? And how might that impact the legal advice I might give? You might be in a position where the world would be your client, but I at least didn't experience that. And I guess if you're in that position, that's a pretty big, you got a lot of worries on your mind at that point. So, I don't know. All right, so let me now change the scenario. You're still working for the United States government, but now you're dealing with a policy issue that's actually quite sensitive. You all know that there's an armed conflict going on in Yemen, right? In Yemen, there's this conflict going on. The Yemenis government has been ejected from the country. The Houthi rebels now are in control of the country, at least most of the country. And as the Yemenis government is trying to regain control, they're getting assistance from Saudi Arabia, right? You all know this. These are factual things that are pretty clear in the news. I want to show you a clip now, and I want you to... This is a clip published by The Telegraph, which is a newspaper outlet in England. And I want you to accept as factual what you see here for the purposes of our discussion. Okay, so accept that as factual, if you will. That attack was conducted by the Saudi Arabian Air Force, and there's a high likelihood that the arms used to conduct that attack were sold to Saudi Arabia by the United States. because the United States sells weapons to Saudi Arabia. This war has been going on for a while. As you saw, the allegation that 4,000 civilians have been killed. There is a legal principle called aid and assist, and what that legal principle says is, if you as a country aid and assist another country in committing human rights violations or law of war violations, you're responsible as a matter of law for a violation of international law. You're sitting now in the councils of the United States, and the issue is raised, why are we supporting and selling stuff to Saudi Arabia when it appears that they're causing civilian deaths? All right, now, keeping in the back of your mind who your client is, what is your legal advice? Do you think it's risky to continue to sell arms to Saudi Arabia? Do you think you're putting the nation at risk as a matter of law by doing this? Do you think that there ought to be a policy decision, and do you think that law ought to factor into that policy decision? And if so, how should it factor into that policy decision such that you, when you give your legal advice, feel comfortable saying what you think you'll say as a legal advisor? What do you think? What are you going to do?
I have no idea. I would just, I mean, obviously there's good and bad that can be used with weapons. Like maybe they're using them to defend themselves as well. Like who knows? There are many other cases that happen in the country than using them to harm people.
Sure, and there's undoubtedly strikes that are done that are perfectly compliant with the law and legal requirements, but it appears there are some that aren't. The fact that there are some that aren't, are you going to say, wow, I don't think we can continue to provide weapons to that country because there's clearly we're accepting some legal risk? Yes?
I think this is very contextual, but could there be an argument made that if there were people at that funeral who were targets, is there any legal precedents protecting them at a time of mourning, or are we allowed to strike if they are assembled?
So the law says if I'm a soldier, I can be killed at any time. I can be killed when I'm on the front lines fighting. I can be killed when I'm at a funeral. I can be killed when I'm in the shower. I can be killed when I'm asleep. That's what the law says. So those people would certainly, assuming that there were some that were there, they would certainly be legitimate targets. But let's assume that at least some of them weren't, and maybe the majority of those people weren't. The world seems pretty condemnatory of what Saudi Arabia is doing. Are you still going to, as a policy matter, are you still going to support them? And as giving legal advice, are you going to support a policy that supports them?
I think that, I mean, looking at the situation, it does seem fairly obviously legally indefensible for the United States to be providing weapons that are used in that manner. But as you said, I mean, that's the legal advice, but how, and I guess this is also a question for you in your work, how did you balance the fact, I mean, when you give law advice to a client in a criminal case, they are inclined to take it because the other option is the law comes down on them, they go to jail for X amount of years and all that. How do you give legal advice to an entity that can, in a historical context, say, yeah, that's good advice, we know we're breaking the law, but we're just going to keep doing it because nobody's going to do anything about it?
That's a great point. I mean, technically your client who is facing criminal time could say the same thing, but his risks are much greater, right? His risks are much greater. So that's an excellent point. And do you factor that into your legal advice? Do you think to yourself, you know, let's see, if I give them the straight legal advice, they might ignore me. So if I bend my legal advice to be a little more soft on their ears, then maybe they'll be more likely to heed it. And if so, do you think you're justified in doing that, in giving your legal advice? Yes.
It seems like an interesting consideration of who your client is. If I'm the State Department, I'm probably more interested in how other countries view this situation, how Israel, all these other, but I'm trying to stabilize this region. How do they view this action from Saudi Arabia? In this Department of Defense, I know there are military bases in Saudi Arabia. I know that they're important from a strategic standpoint in that region. So who am I wanting to support? So I'm interested in who your client is in that.
Yes, okay, so you're getting to exactly the considerations I think that you might be confronted with as a lawyer. If you say, well, no, I don't think we should, look, this looks bad for us. I don't think we should, as a matter of law, we can't support these guys. We'll be aiding and assisting in violation of international law. And they respond by saying, oh, and what about the soldiers we currently have stationed in Saudi Arabia? Or what about the support we're receiving from Saudi Arabia as we conduct operations in Afghanistan and Iraq? Are you willing to turn your back on that? Are you telling me as a matter of law that I have to turn my back on that and give up the support I'm getting from Saudi Arabia? And oh, by the way, do you think if Saudi Arabia can't get the weapons from us, they're just going to stop bombing? Think of all the other people in the world who sell weapons. You think Saudi's not going to go to China or Russia or India or any of these other weapons manufacturers who can sell these weapons? And so then the question is, well, are we better off in than out? Are we better off selling to them because we can exercise some control even though it may present some legal risk? Or are we not? Yes. Sorry, one of you had your hand up. Yes, please.
Yeah, this is a little bit cynical, but I think if your client is the United States as a whole, we do need to take into account what we're getting from the trade with the Saudis, because trade benefits both parties, and so we are benefiting in some way from our weapons trade. So whether that is evidently detrimental to the Saudis, I mean to the Japanese, excuse me, but it is beneficial to America in some way, so that should be taken into account.
Sure, and we're also benefiting from the influence it gives us in the Middle East area, right, to be allied with the Saudis. Do those interests outweigh potential legal risks?
That's the real question, isn't it?
Yes, and what is your answer?
It depends on how much money we're making, honestly.
So you're taking a very utilitarian approach to this. All right, and I would not say that's a bad approach at all. In fact, that's a very easily justifiable approach, a very utilitarian approach, right? I mean, you've got to weigh the interests of the United States, but holy cow, we're lawyers here, right? I've just made you all lawyers. We're lawyers here. And so at some point, aren't you going to say, look, I got your utilitarian argument, I've got your policy call, but I'm telling you what the law is, and look, you can't just step away from the law. I mean, how many of you would say, you think you could get away with this when the policeman pulls you over for speeding on 9th East, which I know you all do? How many of you think that the policeman is going to be sympathetic to your argument of, look, it's really important that I get to school on time. There are lots of things at stake here. I'm a budding intellectual. If I miss the first 10 minutes of that class, I might miss something very important. And I might not rule the world as I currently plan to do. And it would all be your fault because I missed that. I got to speed. I mean, the policeman's going to think that is very interesting and write you a ticket, right? Because in the policeman's mind, that law is supreme. The law is what rules. Is that not true in this case? Should we really let interests take that over? Yes.
Is there any way we can remove ourselves from that legal risk that we get from selling those weapons to the Saudis? Because that way we can still do it, but we don't have that risk for what they do with it.
So the problem, he's saying, is there any way we can remove ourselves from that legal risk? The problem is, it's really up to them. Because once you sell them the weapons, particularly if you know that they're going to use the weapons and that there's evidence that they've used them in the past in a way that violates international law, then you're in. You can't step away from that. So it's almost an issue of, I mean, you can tell the Saudis, look, you got to stop doing this. You got to stop killing these civilians. And they'll say, okay. And then they'll launch the next attack. I mean, so think about it this way. What if you go talk to the Saudis and you say, this is bad for us. We want to keep working with you. And they say, we're trying our best. We're not you. We don't have like super spooky satellites and super cool airplanes. We don't have all that stuff. We do have some of your super cool weapons, and we're using them as best we can. Can you then, does that help your legal answer? Does that help you say, all right, well, if you're doing the best you can and all the other interests come into play, then as a matter of law, the legal advice now is going to be, look, they're doing the best they can. So that's what we can ask. I don't know as a matter of law if you can get away with that, but I think you're at least getting closer. You had your hand up.
Yeah, I think just, we talked about the utilitarian approach and how much money we're making, but we should also consider what pressures other countries will put on us if we continue to sell weapons, because it's not like there's just 3 players here. It's not the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Yemen.
That's right.
Everyone's got a piece, right, of influence there. So
I guarantee you in the back rooms of the UN and other places and institutions, there have been allies of the United States kind of sidle up to the U.S. rep and say, what are you guys doing in Saudi? I mean, really, what are you doing? Are you serious about what you're doing? Are you really selling these weapons to these guys? Really? I mean, have you seen the reports? So there's going to be lots of pressure coming from lots of different directions, and that will figure into our overall interests, right? Because we might decide that our alliance with Saudi Arabia is not as important as our alliance with the UK or with France or with Germany. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know how much is going to help our discussion, but I just thought it was interesting how you're talking about interest. And the thought occurred to me that, people in power create laws in their interest. Like, all law is a matter of interest. If you have something invested in, trading with the Saudis, and it's in our interest to do that, we're a great power. Like, who really is going to come against us and say no because it's in our interest? We have this power. We can kind of just say, we're going to do this anyways, even if it's not generally universally accepted in the world. So I just think that's an interesting point, that interest is what the law is. Like, law is created by interest and interest groups.
So I'm not sure you've sold me on the law is interest. What you have sold me on is that when you're the President of the United States, law is another thing along with interests you consider. In other words, the President of the United States is not that policeman, right? The President of the United States views law maybe a little more utilitarian-y, that's not a word, a little more... You
created the word.
There you go. That word I just created, he views it as that. He's looking at law more as a tool. It's one of a number of things he considers, right? And the President may say, look, I got you, lawyer. Thanks for your advice, but I got all these other interests I'm concerned about, and they may either trump the law, they may support the law, they may overcome the law. How they interact with law may be a difficult decision, but it might be different than me just saying, oh, that's the law. Oh, okay, I got it. That's what I got to do. Yes?
So looking at it from the utilitarian perspective, how much do you think human rights violations are worth?
Looking at it from the utilitarian perspective, how much do I think human rights violations are worth? That's a great question. What do you think?
I get how sometimes you have to do bad things to reach good ends, right? But I do think that in order to, by continuing giving weapons, we're then sanctioning this situation, right? We're saying, well, we're okay with it, we're still going to provide it. Like, if nothing else, it's symbolic, right?
Yeah.
So then we have to weigh not only this situation across America here, but the precedents it sets to the Americans are okay with this.
Right.
If you help them.
Right.
And I don't know what price to put on that, but I think it'd have to be pretty steep.
And I think the State Department is going to be arguing that, right? They're going to say, look, if you do this in America, you're setting a precedent. That then when some other country that we think is less trustworthy does the same thing, we're not going to be able to say to them, you shouldn't be doing that, because they're going to say, well, let me just show you some historical footage, right? And then what do you say? So I think what you would say is you would expect the President, when you say, Mr. President, Madam President, this is illegal under international law, you would expect the President to say, all right, we're not going to do it then, right?
I would hope, yeah.
All right, so let's keep that thought in mind. Let me show you another video clip. All right, this, it's so graphic, the computer refuses to play it. Here we go.
The attack on the village of Han began just after sunrise. It's believed to be the largest and deadliest chemical attack in Syria in years, killing dozens of villagers, many of them children, and leaving many others gasping for breath and coughing uncontrollably. Hospitals were packed with victims. In some cases, their pupils were not reacting to light. That's a sure indication that the victims were exposed to a toxic nerve agent. protecting them in still back evidence. Everyone that wants this evidence to investigate, please contact me. A spokeswoman for the group Physicians for Human Rights says there doesn't appear to be much doubt about what kind of attack this was.
Everything we reviewed, the photos and videos showing patients with clear respiratory distress, pupils that had shrunk down to the size of just tiny pinpoints that are non-reactive to light, foaming at the mouth, dozens of people, up to maybe hundreds of people who are showing these symptoms across the board. All of this is consistent with nerve agent exposure, such as sarin gas.
Okay. I think we can all safely assume that that's an illegal act, right? Using chemical weapons on your people is an illegal act. So now you're sitting in the councils of the United States government, and the president comes in, is enraged, and says, we have got to do something. And it just so happens that our intel folks have just told us about an airport in Syria where there are what we believe some chemical compounds, precursors to chemical weapons that will undoubtedly be used for similar attacks. I want to strike. Now, in this case, which is, of course, a true case, you know the incident, right? I mean, the United States attacked a Syrian airport specifically to kill these kinds of chemical weapons. And what I will tell you is that you will not find an announcement by the U.S. government of the legal basis by which they conducted that attack in Syria. And do you want me to tell you why? I can't. But I will leave it to your own supposition to figure out if the U.S. did something like that and could not publicly give you a legal justification that you might think there might not be a good solid legal justification. So now, those of you who want the president to abide by international law, but you're watching video clips of kids like that being killed by chemical weapons, what role should the law play there, national security lawyer? What are you willing to do and say now? Yes.
So, going back to negotiations, I would say, when was our law, our treaty, our contract written, and what did we actually say to you? What kind of weapons did we provide? And if you want to continue this contract, what will we provide you now? So we'll research, we'll do statistics, we'll say these guns can harm these many people and do this much damage to this population. These bombs will do the same, these airplanes, these aircrafts will too. And that's how I would continue if they only had something that they would be able to provide us, like oil.
Okay, so you're again talking about interests and self-interest, and if they're giving us stuff, what are we going to give them, and how are we going to use that as leverage to do? But in the case of Syria, remember, we're not giving them a whole bunch of stuff. And Syria instead is kind of mocking us because we haven't taken action in certain cases where they've used chemical weapons. This is probably the third or fourth publicized time that they've used them, and we have not taken, I mean, you remember President Obama, right? President Obama said, look, I'm drawing a red line. If Syria uses chemical weapons again, we're coming in. And then guess what did Syria do? They used chemical weapons, and what did President Obama do? Nothing, right? And this is not a statement on President Obama, because I got to tell you, he did not make that decision in a vacuum to not do that. He was getting advice from all kinds of people, including our allies. But the point is, he didn't. President Trump, on the other hand, didn't seek help and assistance and advice from our international allies, and instead took action. And again, no legal justification. So if you're the person sitting in those councils and the president comes in before he makes his decision and he says, this is a moral outrage. There are tens, probably hundreds, maybe thousands of people dying from the use of chemical weapons. Oh, are you trying to tell me that because the law says I can't do it, that I have to sit here and watch that happen? National security lawyer? Is that what you're telling me?
I know in the early 1900s there was no federal law against killing a federal officer, and in the early gang wars in Chicago, if somebody killed a federal officer, the federal government wasn't allowed by law to come after them with federal agents. And I think in this case as well, it's up to the coalition and up to law instituting bodies for them to decide what law should be in the future. I don't think it's the president's responsibility in our case to say who he can and who he can't attack with military force. True, he is the commander-in-chief, but it's also up to Congress as well. They have a say, and I think it needs to follow the rules that were put in place, or they need to change the rules that they've put in place. But it needs to follow that structure.
Okay, well, so in this case, the violation attacking Syria is not a violation of domestic law, it's a violation of international law. So even if Congress was online, even if the president went to Congress and said, Congress, can I do this? And Congress said yes, it would now be lawful under domestic law, but it still would not be lawful under international law. So to get it lawful under international law, you'd have to go to the United Nations Security Council, right? And who sits on the United Nations Security Council? Well, there is this country called Russia, who happens to be allied with Syria on this issue. What do you think are the chances they're going to vote for it? None, right? So again, I put you back, national security lawyer, in that seat. The president says, okay, we tried that, we tried that, we tried that. Still no legal option. Do I really have to sit here and watch Assad gas his people? Is that really where I'm at? Is the law really a straitjacket that ties me in that way?
I feel like the attacks on Syria would be justified because, like, I mean, what the Syrian government is doing to its people is, I mean, I would classify it as a genocide, and I know that you have to go through, you know, the proper legitimate authority of the UN Security Council to officially declare that a genocide, but I feel like, you know, that's just something that would never happen, but, like, if one country decided to unilaterally attack Syria for, like, their crimes, I feel like they could be justified under that clause.
So, right, so the responsibility to protect or humanitarian intervention, that's what the UK called their reason for intervening in Kosovo. They said, look, there's a humanitarian disaster here. People are being killed for their racial background, and we can't stand by and watch it. So we're going to say that there's this justification called humanitarian intervention. Guess what the problem with that is? When the UK said that, the US said, no, we don't believe in that. So if we try that one, we have to do a little back paddling, a little tap dance. And well, we know we said we didn't like that before, but now we do. It's really a good thing now. It's a hard, right? It's a hard sell. You could do it because we can change our mind, but it's a harder sell because we condemned it once before. All right, so think of all those situations, and now I want you to think about how the fact that you are an LDS attorney sitting in those national security councils should impact that. Should you be authorizing the United States to bomb members of the Yemeni Third Ward? Should you be allowing this moral outrage against fellow children of God because it's not lawful? To what extent do you think your knowledge and commitment to the gospel, your understanding of the plan of salvation, your understanding of God's plan for us should impact your role as a national security attorney, if at all? Maybe not. Maybe you say my role here as a national security attorney is to the law. What I think about the gospel is my own personal thing, and it doesn't come into my life, but maybe it does. Yes?
I guess some thoughts I had were to bring the religion side of it is, as an LDS attorney, you know, we have this belief, like you said, that the children of God who killed in Syria by chemicals. And so I feel like, in some sense, law and religion are similar because they both kind of go back to this idea that there's some power enforcing rules, right? But in the case of law, we didn't go out in nature and climb some mountains and find, oh, we found law. You know, law is something created by human beings. And human beings, as we know, are imperfect. Hence, we're dealing with situations like Syria. Hence, there's things like Yemen. And so I feel like as an LDS attorney, I don't think there's anything wrong with bringing universal truths because those things we believe are outside of man-made creation such as law. And if the point of law is to serve people and to make life better for others, it seems I'm silly or maybe ignorant to tie ourselves to something we created when obviously higher principles are being violated. So those are my thoughts.
So I take from that if you're sitting in the councils with respect to the Syrian bombing, you would say to the President of the United States, not lawful international law, but we should do it. Because there's a higher reason. This is a moral issue. This is about our morality as a nation, and we can't let those people suffer, right? That's how you'd approach it. Okay, I got it. Yes. Yes.
Well, I think that the
you know, we have the law that marriage is between one man and one woman, but at one point in our history, like, that wasn't the case. And I think it's the same thing, like, we have these international laws for a reason, but there's sometimes that there's a higher law, and there's this, I think, a moral obligation to help people above anything that an international law would say.
It's a great point. I mean, the benefit to the transition between polygamy and monogamy was it was done by a prophet of God, right? I mean, it was Wilford Woodruff who made that call. I guess if you're a national security law advisor in this case, it would be really nice if you had the hotline to President Monson, right? President Monson, sorry to bug you. I just got this issue. Could you give me some help on this? I mean, that would be ideal, but we should be able to seek personal inspiration, get personal revelation, and get answers in the same way, right? I mean, we should be able to get answers in the same way because Heavenly Father has told us He'll inspire us within the sphere of our influence. If we're the ones providing advice to the President of the United States, we should have the right to that kind of inspiration. Yes?
I think the problem, though, here is that the reason we have laws, that we create them as a group, is to try to estimate a higher law. And if we decide that as Americans or as the Defense Council, we are the authority in what the higher law is, what happens when corrupt people end up in that situation? And they're the people who get to decide what the higher law is and are no longer bound by precedent to laws that have been established.
You keep coming back to this idea that what we do, other people may copy later. That's a very inconvenient argument to be raising. We do also have this article of faith, right, that says we believe in honoring, obeying, and sustaining the law. It doesn't say we believe in honoring, obeying, and sustaining the community law, the domestic law, the law about speeding. It just says the law. And we recognize, we the United States, recognize international law as law. In fact, we sign up to things specifically saying we think international law is it. We think we should be following international law. So I think that presents a difficulty. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say a really similar comment, but I do think additionally it undermines our own authority with other countries. It undermines how they view us if we're willing to maybe, I don't know, change the law or act according to the law in certain situations. And it doesn't provide a precedent for warranting maybe acts in the name of like justice or this immaterial form of justice when they could be coming from a place that's, I guess if the intentions may not be there, it could become a way for other countries to use that same sort of reasoning as an excuse to do really horrible.
Absolutely, as a justification to do something that we would not contemplate, but that would be contemplated by other nations who maybe were less driven by some of the same interests and morals we are. Yes, sir.
I would just like to kind of second what he said. I think from the standpoint of like human rights violations and seeing each other as like sons and daughters of God, we need to take into consideration what goes on with the Yemen case and with Syria. And I guess, like obviously it's nice to think about precedent, it's nice to think about what might happen afterwards. But the fact of the matter is, from a morality standpoint, I think for my judgment that I have, I think it's hard to kind of sit there and see horrible things happen to people and not sit around and do something about it. We need to love our brothers and sisters in a way that realistically we would.
Okay, so I'm running out of time. Thank you for so engaging this conversation. I would like to keep going. Come back. We'll do this again. The issue with law and policy, the one about the Yemeni bombing and selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, to me, that law and policy is difficult, but it's not as difficult as the law and morality question that we deal with the Syria chemical weapons, right? I mean, that in my mind is where we as Latter-day Saint lawyers, I'm assuming you're all coming to law school, we as Latter-day Saint lawyers have some of the toughest decisions because we do understand the plan of salvation. We do understand God's plan for us. We do understand higher law, if you want to call it that. We do understand where law fits into the overall plan that Heavenly Father has for us. And we also have access to inspiration and revelation that others may not have. And maybe we have an obligation to seek that inspiration. So let me ask you this question. If you're sitting in the councils that I have put you in, and you know what the gospel answer is, do you accept an obligation to step forward? Do you instead just say, look, I'm the lawyer. I'm giving my legal advice. They're not asking me for my policy opinion, my morality opinion. I'm the lawyer. They hired me to tell them what the law is. I'm going to tell them what the law is, and then I'm going to sit quietly and let them kind of work it out. Or do you feel an obligation? Do you feel like you need to stand up? You need to come forward and say, here is what I believe is right. Yes.
So I think you're right when you're talking about having the obligation to make sure that we are following the tenets of our own religion, right, so that we can draw on those powers. And I think when we're in those situations and when you're in a role that requires that the Lord needs to use your tool, that's essentially what He's doing. That inspiration will come, and so yes, you can say this is the law, and then you can say, and on a human level, this is where where I'm at, and what's going to help you sleep at night, and those are easy decisions to make, but a lot of times in those situations, that's when the Spirit can weave a plan that is beyond what your studies would have ever given you, or beyond what the collective mind in that group would have ever given you, because it's coming from someone who does see more. And so it is our obligation then to make sure that we are reading our scriptures, that we're going to the temple, that we're doing all of those things, so that in those moments we can combine the two. And it's not about being preachy, it's not about saying, well, in my church, but it's about being the tool that the Lord needs you to be.
Do you remember what Mordecai said to Esther?
No, but I remember what Nephi said to Laman.
That's good. What Mordecai said to Esther, though, may also apply, which is, Mordecai says to Esther, who knows what the Lord raised you up, I'm paraphrasing, who knows what the Lord raised you up for this cause, right? You all sit here now as undergrads. Who knows but what you are the ones who are going to be sitting in those councils 20 years from now and going to be the one faced with that difficult situation and going to be the one who has the option of standing up and saying, I hope that is so. I hope it is you, because I've worked with a lot of people who I love in the government, but I would trust each of you, I think, to get that inspiration at the time and to know what to do in those very difficult circumstances better. And I hope you guys will step up and do that. I hope you'll come to law school. I hope you'll do national security law, and I hope you'll put yourself in a position and prepare yourselves to make those kind of calls when those kind of calls need to be made. Thank you.